Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Today we've got a few things to discuss, including a few signings, a major one in Ottawa, plus a few smaller ones in LA and Colorado. We've got a few professional tryouts to announce, and why the Washington Capitals, Philadelphia Flyers, Boston Bruins, and Winnipeg Jets need to start fast or there could be major changes coming their way. And this is all coming up right now. Hello and welcome to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. I wanted to start off today by discussing a few signings, starting in LA. So first, the LA Kings had two contracts left to sign, two RFA defensemen, but they did get one of them done recently, signing defenseman Michael Anderson to a 1-year, $1 million deal. Now this is a good deal for Anderson. Anderson has been a top four defenseman over the past few years, playing more on top pair with the defenseman Drew Doughty. He is more of a defensive defenseman. You don't see him putting up too many points. He had 8 points last year in 57 games, not reaching his career high of 11 points in the shortened season. But he can be a good stabilizing defenseman. He can stay back while his partner can play up in the play. Definitely a good signing for the LA Kings. It's not too long, only 1 year. He'll be a restricted free agent at the end of the deal, so LA will be able to re-sign Anderson next year. And if Anderson can maybe put up some more point totals, maybe get somewhere between 50 and 20 points, I could definitely see him getting a contract next year of over $2 million. But I think that as a defensive defenseman, his first goal is to defend, and I think points come second to a guy like him. But definitely, a 1-year, $1 million deal for Anderson is a really good signing, and I think that the LA Kings will have to turn to try and sign Sean Durzi, who is definitely a lot more of a point producer than Anderson is after last year. But with only one RFA left, the Kings are getting more and more of their business done, and it's a really good signing to see Anderson, who will be back in LA this year. Next, we have the top unrestricted free agent left on the market after guys like Kessel, Stastny, and Kadri signed, and Evan Rodrigues has finally found a place he can call home, and that is the Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche signed Evan Rodrigues to a 1-year, $2 million deal. Now, Rodrigues has been mostly a bottom six forward throughout his career in Buffalo and Pittsburgh, but last year in Pittsburgh, with injuries to guys like Jason Zucker and Evgeny Malkin, he got an expanded role. And in that expanded role, he put up a career-high 19 goals and 43 points in 82 games, which blew his career high of 29 points out of the water, which he had in Buffalo. But definitely, Rodrigues is a good middle six forward, playing majority of last year in the top 9 with Pittsburgh. I think if he was to continue to play a top 9 role, he could probably produce between 35 and 45 points consistently. It's only a 1-year deal, but this will definitely help the Avalanche. They lost major top 6 components of their cup run from last year, such as Nazem Kadri and Andrei Burakovsky. So I would think that Newhook probably gets the second line center role in Colorado this year. He seems ready to step in. But with one of the wing spots on the second pair open, I could see Rodrigues fitting in well on the second line. Maybe playing with like a Newhook or a Nichushkin, or maybe the Avalanche shake up their top 6 and move one of Landeskog or Rantanen into the second line. But I definitely think this is a really good signing. Definitely see Rodrigues putting up at least 35, if not 45, maybe even 50 points with the Avalanche this year. But definitely a really good signing. He'll be unrestricted free agent again next year, and maybe if he continues to show that he can be a consistent 40 to 50 point producer, he can get maybe a little bit more term and a little bit more money on his next contract. But definitely a good deal for Rodrigues. And lastly, I want to touch on the Ottawa Senators. Now, this is a deal that no one was really expecting, at least right now. It would have probably been later on into the season when they signed him. But the Ottawa Senators have extended young center Timmy Stutzle to a 8-year, $8.35 million extension. Now, this is a massive signing for Stutzle. Stutzle had an amazing season last year, putting out 22 goals and 59 points in 79 games. And he was definitely playing at a high level last year after doubling his point total from his rookie year. Now, he had some good wingers last year on his line. Joseph, Connor Brown, Alex Formenton. But this year, he could easily have Claude Giroux and Alex DeBrincat, two off-season acquisitions, as his wingers, which means it's really not far-fetched to say that he hit 70, 80 points this year. and I think this could become a really good deal for the Ottawa Senators. I think signing him to an $8 million deal when he's only had 2 years left is a little bit risky, but probably not much, because he's really going to hit home on most of these things. He's definitely already proven himself a top 6 forward. He plays a lot better as a center than a winger. Last year when he switched to center, he definitely doubled up in points. So I definitely think that they have a really good player in Stutzle, and I think he's just going to continue to grow. If he plays with guys like Giroux or DeBrincat, or if they put Giroux or DeBrincat on the top line this year, or one of them, maybe guys like Kachuk or Batherson, either way, he's going to have elite wingers this year. And I think by the end of this contract, I would not be shocked if Stutzle had at least 1 or 2 90-point seasons, and it wouldn't surprise me if he hit 100, as I think that Stutzle could definitely be, in the long run, the best player taken in the 2020 draft. No offense to Lafreniere or Byfield, but he has definitely been the most productive of those players. So that's all the signings that we have today. Now I want to get to some PTOs. Now, a PTO is a professional tryout. It's not exactly an NHL contract, but it's for a player to go to training camp with a team to try out and see if he can actually get an NHL contract. It's more for those fringe players who are maybe good enough to make the NHL, but maybe would be more AHL players. So definitely some of these guys will get NHL contracts. Some will probably have to settle for being free agents and waiting for an opportunity. But some of the more significant ones that have come up would be Danny Dekeyser in Vancouver, Calvin Haan in Carolina, and Aston Reese in Toronto. Now, Dekeyser had 11 points in 59 games last year. He's more of a third pair defenseman, maybe seventh. He plays on the left side, so it's not really the main area of concern for Vancouver. But if he can show in camp that he's still a good third pair defenseman, and they don't go out and acquire the defenseman and Pullman's still out to start the year, then I definitely could see him get a contract opportunity with Vancouver. Definitely he'll have to see how training camp goes for him, but Dekeyser's definitely one of the guys I could see get a contract before the season starts. Haan in Carolina is another one. I was surprised he did not get a contract. He's been a really good top 4 defenseman for the Blackhawks over the past few years since signing with them. But I definitely do think he will get some sort of a contract. He had 4 goals and 8 points in 69 games last year. And given the fact that he can play a top 4 role, whether it's in Carolina or somewhere else, I definitely think he will get an NHL contract. Definitely a team who needs a third pair defenseman. Haan can play both sides, so it really doesn't matter for him, but a team who needs a third pair defenseman and could use a veteran to help with some of the younger players, I definitely think could use a guy like Haan if they can't find a trade elsewhere. And another one would be Aston Reese. Aston Reese had 5 goals and 15 points in 69 games between the Pittsburgh Penguins and Anaheim Ducks last year. Aston Reese is a solid bottom 6 forward for probably most teams. He's more of a fourth liner, but can play third line minutes. He would be definitely a great fit if he does get a contract in Toronto, depending on how camp goes. But if he doesn't get one in Toronto, I could see a couple of other teams who need some depth pieces be interested in Aston Reese. Maybe a team like Carolina, Ottawa, or Colorado who could use a depth defenseman might be interested in Aston Reese. Maybe there's someone else, but I definitely think Aston Reese, Haan should definitely have contracts by the time camp starts. Maybe Dekeyser, depending on how he does in camp, but definitely these are 3 of the more prominent PTOs that have been signed by teams who are looking to go into training camp, play well, and then hopefully get an NHL contract for the upcoming season. That's all of those PTOs stuff I want to talk about today. And lastly, I want to talk about how some of these teams really need to start fast. Otherwise, there could be potential rebuilds starting. So, first I want to talk about the Jets. Winnipeg is coming off a season where they barely missed the playoffs. They were about 8 points out of the playoffs, I want to say. Barely missed. They were the second runner-up for last year, but they really didn't do anything this year. Most of it has been speculation. There was a lot of talk about maybe Mark Scheifele being dealt, maybe Blake Wheeler being dealt, Dubois wanting out of Winnipeg. They re-signed Dubois. Wheeler and Scheifele are still there. Their D-core hasn't changed at all, and that was one of their problems from last year. And in net, they probably have a little bit of a worse backup in David Riddick than they did in Eric Comrie last year. So it's fair to say that the Jets haven't done nearly enough. And if the Jets start really, really poorly and lose a majority of their first 10, 15, 20 games, I could see them start to trade off pieces. Their D-core is getting older. They do have Morrissey and Pionka on the back end, who are still really good defensemen, but you have aging guys like Nate Schmidt, Dylan DeMello, Brendan Dillon, all of guys who are nearing the end of their contracts. I think Dillon and DeMello both have 2 years left on their deal. Schmidt has 3, but all of them could be on the move if they start poorly. That D-core really didn't do well last year. They wanted to get some more youth into their lineup. They have Stanley, who's been in there for the last couple of years. They're trying to bring up Dylan Sandberg and Ville Heinola. But definitely, I think a defenseman could be on the move if they start. Maybe Blake Wheeler gets moved if they start poorly. I know there was a lot of talk about Wheeler maybe being moved. He could be a trade chip that they could use to get something back. If they retained, he's only got 2 years left on his deal, so if they retain some money to make the cap work a little bit, I think they could get a few decent pieces in a Blake Wheeler trade. Maybe even Mark Scheifele gets dealt. He's also got 2 years left on his deal, and he's a really good second-line center. So maybe he gets dealt. I think if the Dubois deal happens, it would be more in the off-season next year. But at the forward group, they definitely have some prominent prospects like a Cole Perfetti, a Chaz Lucius, a Ryan McGrady, who they just drafted. So they definitely have a couple of pieces that they have for the future. But this depth on the forward group is not too good, and their defense did not change from last year when they didn't do too well. So really, the Jets could have a really bad start to the year, and I wonder if maybe they start bad. They start following their Central Division rivals, footsteps of the Blackhawks and the Coyotes, where they start trying to tear it down a bit. I would not be shocked if they were to start a full rebuild if they do not do very good to start the year, as I could see them move a couple of defensemen, a few forwards, and with the fact that they're not really deep at either of those positions, I think that they could try, if not a rebuild, then a retool of some sorts. But the Jets definitely need to start fast and start well, or things could go downhill really quickly. In Washington, they have an aging core and are injured to start the year. The Caps have Backstrom and Wilson starting in injury reserve. Both seem to be progressing really well with their injuries. Backstrom will most likely be done for the entire year. If anything, probably back February, March, possibly, but for the most part, he's probably not going to be there. Wilson will probably be back late November, early December, sometime around there, but they're definitely going to miss him for the first few months. And if they start really poorly without 2 of their best offensive weapons, I could see them start to rebuild. The Capitals are a team who a lot of people usually think are going to do poorly because of their aging core, but they always find some way to make the playoffs. But with the injuries, if you look at their team, they did bring in Kemper this year, but their backup position is a little bit murky with AHL goalie Charlie Lindgren being brought in to solidify their backup position. He's a little bit of an unknown factor. On their defense, they have John Carlson, who's still signed for a while, and Martin Ferravari, who's going to be an RFA at the end of the year. And they have a couple of good other pieces in Washington, like Nick Jensen, Dmitry Orlov, Trevor Van Riemsdyk. But of the 7 players who probably make the roster, 5 of them are pending UFAs. So that D-core next year could look completely different. You also have a lot of offensive weapons like Connor Brown, Lars Eller, Garnet Hathaway, Marcus Johansson, amongst others, who could be dealt if they don't start out well. And on top of that, they have an aging core. Ovechkin signed for still a few years. He's 36 years old. Oshie started to decline. He's 35 years old. Backstrom now has hip surgery. Is he ever going to be the same as he was over the last few years? He's 34 years old. So this is a team who is definitely an aging group. They do have a couple of young players. Connor McMichael and Hendrix Lapierre up front are probably guys who make the roster this year and start to solidify themselves as top 9 forwards in Washington. You also have guys like Alexiev and Johansson on the back end who probably could challenge for a roster spot in a few years. I definitely think that the Caps would have wanted them to challenge already, but I could have seen Alexiev make the roster this year if he wasn't injured to start the season. But definitely I think that if the Washington Capitals start out rocky and they lose like majority of their first 15, 20 games, and given the state of their roster, I could see them start to sell off pieces and maybe go into a rebuild over the next 2-3 years to try and make this a younger team who can still compete for a playoff spot. In Philadelphia, they've had a lot of question marks. Apparently their locker room is really, really bad. Even Coach Don Tortorella has said so recently himself. So the Flyers have a lot of problems, and on top of that, they have a couple of injuries to start the season as well. They have Ryan Ellis, who has regrettably never really fit with Philadelphia, given the fact he's always been injured. He was acquired last offseason, but only played 4 games last year due to the fact he was always injured, and he's going to be injured to start this year. They also have offensive weapons, Joel Farabee and rookie Bobby Brink, who are going to be out to start the year due to injuries. Both of them are probably going to be out until mid-November at earliest. So, given all of their injuries, it's quite possible they start out not too good. I currently don't have them making the playoffs. I don't have them making the playoffs by any means. I think the Caps, the Jets could probably compete for a playoff spot. I don't have the Flyers even competing for a playoff spot. I just don't think they're that good right now. And with that much of a problem in their locker room, I think they could start out very bad. They don't have a clear-cut backup goalie. Best option for backup is Felix Sandstrom, and he hasn't really played much in the NHL. He played a few games last year, but he's not a legit NHL backup. So they really don't have an NHL backup to go into the year. They have a lot of question marks on the defense. The last few years, Evan Provorov hasn't been playing to his potential. So he could be a guy who's maybe, if they start out shaky, maybe they consider trading Provorov. That would be a huge trade. They also have Travis Sanheim and Justin Braun, 2 really good players who are entering the final year of their deal. So if the Flyers are looking like they're going to miss the playoffs, do they trade one of those 2? I know Sanheim and Ristolainen were really good partners last year in Ristolainen's first year. So do you really want to get rid of Sanheim? If the Flyers start out poorly this year, some forwards could be Travis Konechny and James Van Riemsdyk. I know that on my blog, I thought that the Flyers would have found a way to move one of James Van Riemsdyk or Konechny this year, but given that they haven't been able to find a trade for them, they were trying to move Van Riemsdyk to bring in Gaudreau, but they couldn't because the asking price was so high in Van Riemsdyk. But given the fact Van Riemsdyk is going into the final year of his deal, maybe they retain half of his salary, make it 3.5. That's a lot more palatable for a team to take on. I definitely think that James Van Riemsdyk at $3.5 million for however long the season is when they trade him would definitely be interesting to a few teams. Konechny has a $5 million cap hit, so he's not really cheap, but he is young, so he has potential to still grow into more. He's a good middle 6 forward. James Van Riemsdyk's more of a third liner, so I do think that these 2 could be players that are moved if they don't start out well. Maybe they move Atkinson. I don't think that's really likely at this point, but I do think that it's possible they do end up trying to move Atkinson if they don't start well. But definitely I think Sanheim, Provorov, Braun, Konechny, JVR, this Flyers team probably doesn't do too well this year, and I know they've been saying aggressive retool in the offseason to try and get up, try and get back to the playoffs after missing over the past few years. But after these moves in the offseason, I really can't see them making the playoffs. I definitely could see them starting out poorly, and if that happens, I could definitely see them trying to make trades to get better for the future, and maybe after this year they finally start their rebuild. And lastly, with Boston. Now the Bruins do have some injuries to start the year, just like Philadelphia and Washington. They're going to miss Marchand, McAvoy, and Grzelcyk to start the year. Grzelcyk should probably be back around November-ish, with McAvoy, Marchand probably sometime around December. But if you're missing these sorts of players, Marchand is a huge player to that team, and McAvoy is their best defenseman, and Grzelcyk's a really integral part of their top 4 on the D-core. So missing these 3 guys to start the year is going to be huge to Boston. If they can tread water until they get back, I could definitely see them contending for a playoff spot. I don't think they're going to be a top 3 team this year with them missing all that time, but I could definitely see them getting a wildcard spot if they can tread water until Marchand and McAvoy get back. But if they start out really, really poorly, and Ottawa, Detroit, those 2 teams who have done really well this offseason to try and be more competitive, go out and start showing people that they are ready to compete for playoff spots, and Boston starts sinking and sinking, it would be really difficult for them to try and get back in the playoff race. And if that happens, maybe it's time for the Bruins to say it's time for a rebuild. They have been going forward with this core for a very long time. I definitely think that this core could definitely use a shakeup. Now, in net, they have a really good tandem of Ullmark and Swayman that I don't think will be moved at any time over the next few years. Ullmark's still signed for 3 years, and Swayman's the RFA. I don't see either of them being moved. I could see them move some of their defensemen, especially when Marchand and McAvoy get back. They're going to have to try and move some salary to become cap compliant. So maybe a guy like Mike Riley or Derek Forbort, who has 2 years left at $3 million, are ones to go. I definitely think that Connor Clifton, who has a year left, like Forbort, Riley, even Grzelcyk to some extent, could be traded. Forbort, Riley, Grzelcyk all have 2 years left. Clifton's a year away from unrestricted free agency. But I definitely think that with Boston having McAvoy, Lindholm, and Carlo locked up long-term on the fence, I don't really see any of those 3 moving. So I could see them try and shuffle the bottom pair, maybe Grzelcyk, but not really much for the defense. I do think they could try and get younger on the D core. They don't really have much major prospects that could fill in roles, but I definitely think that could be a point of drafting over the next few years, trying to upgrade that defense. And lastly, on their forward group, they have a ton of players on expiring contracts. They brought back Patrice Bergeron and David Krejci. These could be their final attempts at trying to make another run at the Stanley Cup. Both Krejci and Bergeron are getting older, and this could be their last year before retirement. We won't know right now, but it's definitely possible that this could be Krejci and Bergeron's final year. But they also have a lot of guys. Craig Smith, Tomasz Nosek, Pavel Zacha. You also have Nick Foligno. And on top of all of that, David Pastrnak, all being UFAs at the end of the year. Most of their forward group is going to be a UFA at the end of the year. The only guys who are really signed past this year on the Bruins forward group is Marchand, Charlie Coyle, Taylor Hall, and Jake DeBrusk. And even DeBrusk has had speculations about him being traded. So I definitely think that if the Bruins start out poorly this year, it might just be time to start a rebuild and maybe try and get younger to compete again in a few years' time, as Ottawa and Detroit are starting to prove to become more competitive, and the Toronto, Tampa, and Florida don't look to be slowing down anytime soon. So this is all I want to talk about today. Remember to like this channel and subscribe. Remember, I also do a blog. I will link in the description below, and I can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you soon.